When my mother died, my father married another woman without telling me anything. I never thought the worst betrayal of my life would come from the person who was supposed to protect me the most. Picture this. You come home after 3 months of trying to heal from losing your mother, expecting to help your grieving father through the worst period of his life, and instead you walk into your childhood kitchen to find a complete stranger wearing your dead mother's apron, sitting in your mother's chair, and calling your father honey, like she owns the place. That's exactly what happened to me, and what I discovered next will make your blood boil. "Who are you?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper, still processing what I was seeing. The woman looked at me with a mixture of guilt and defiance, while my father stood frozen by the refrigerator like a deer caught in headlights. "Oh, sweetheart, you must be Jessica," she said with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "I'm Linda, your father's wife." The word wife hit me like a physical blow. Wife? My mother had been dead for only 4 months, and this stranger was calling herself my father's wife? I looked at my father, waiting for him to explain, to tell me this was some kind of sick joke or misunderstanding. But instead, he just stood there, unable to meet my eyes, his face red with shame. "Dad?" I whispered, hoping against hope that there was some logical explanation for what I was witnessing. "Jessica, honey, we need to talk," he finally said, his voice shaking. "Let's go to the living room." As I followed my father into the room where my mother used to read her books and where we had celebrated every Christmas morning, I noticed that all of her pictures had been replaced with photos of this Linda woman. My mother's favorite chair now had a different cushion, and the smell of her lavender perfume had been replaced by some cheap vanilla scent that made my stomach turn. This wasn't just a betrayal. This was a complete erasure of my mother's existence. "Dad, please tell me you didn't marry this woman 4 months after Mom died," I said, though the evidence was right there in front of me. His silence was answer enough, but what he said next would shatter my world even more completely than I could have ever imagined. "Jessica, we got married 2 weeks ago," my father said, avoiding my gaze like a guilty child. "It was a small ceremony at the courthouse, just Linda, me, and 2 witnesses. 2 weeks ago, while I was visiting Mom's grave on what would have been her 52nd birthday, my father was exchanging vows with a complete stranger. The betrayal cut so deep I could barely breathe. "How could you do this to Mom's memory?" I whispered, tears streaming down my face. "She's been gone for 4 months, Dad. 4 months." Linda chose that moment to walk into the living room, carrying a tray of coffee like she owned the place. "Jessica, I know this is hard for you, but your father was so lonely," she said with fake sympathy dripping from her voice. "I've been taking care of him since the funeral. We fell in love, and sometimes love doesn't wait for anyone's timeline." The audacity of this woman talking about love while sitting in my dead mother's house made my blood boil. "Taking care of him since the funeral?" I repeated, the pieces starting to fall into place. "You mean you moved in here immediately after my mother died?" My father's face went pale, and Linda's confident smile faltered slightly. That's when I realized this betrayal was even worse than I had initially thought. "Linda helped me through the darkest time of my life," my father said defensively. "Your mother would have wanted me to be happy." The mention of my mother's wishes sent me over the edge. My mother, who had spent her final days in the hospital worried about leaving Dad alone, who had made me promise to take care of him, who had died believing her husband would honor her memory for more than 4 measly months. But what Linda said next would reveal the true depth of their deception, and it would change everything I thought I knew about my mother's final months. "Actually, Jessica," Linda said with a smirk that sent chills down my spine, "your father and I met 6 months before your mother passed away." The room went silent, except for the sound of my heart pounding in my ears. 6 months before? That meant we became friends when I started working as a volunteer at the hospital where your mother was receiving treatment. She continued casually, as if she hadn't just dropped a bombshell that shattered my entire understanding of my parents' marriage. I looked at my father, waiting for him to deny it, to tell me Linda was lying, but his expression told me everything I needed to know. "Dad, please tell me you didn't have an affair while Mom was dying of cancer," I said, my voice breaking. The silence stretched between us like a chasm, filled only by the ticking of my mother's antique clock that somehow Linda hadn't thrown away yet. "It wasn't like that, Jessica," my father finally whispered. "Your mother was so sick, and Linda was just there. She listened to me when I needed someone to talk to." But his words only made it worse. While my mother was fighting for her life, enduring chemotherapy sessions that left her weak and nauseous, my father was developing feelings for another woman who was supposed to be helping families cope with tragedy. "How long were you planning to hide this from me?" I demanded. "Were you hoping I'd just accept this new reality when I came home?" Linda exchanged a look with my father that made my stomach turn. There was something else they weren't telling me. Something that would make this betrayal even more devastating than it already was. Jessica, there's something else you need to know, my father said, his voice barely audible. Linda and we're expecting a baby. The words hit me like a sledgehammer to the chest. A baby? My father was 58 years old, and this woman who had destroyed my family was carrying his child? I felt like I was living in some twisted nightmare from which I couldn't wake up. Before you judge me for what I did next, let me ask you something. What would you do if you discovered your father had not only betrayed your dying mother, but was also starting a new family before her body was even cold in the ground? Leave a comment and tell me. Have you ever felt this kind of rage and heartbreak at the same time? If this story is hitting you as hard as it hit me when I lived it, please leave a like so I know you're with me on this emotional journey. You got her pregnant while Mom was dying? I screamed, not caring that the neighbors might hear. How could you do this to our family? Linda placed her hand protectively over her still flat stomach, playing the victim even though she had been the one who destroyed everything. Jessica, I know you're upset, but you need to calm down for the baby's sake, she said with that condescending tone that made me want to shake her. My father stood up and tried to approach me, but I backed away from him like he was a stranger. In many ways, he was. The man who had raised me, who had taught me about loyalty and family values, who had cried at my mother's funeral and promised to keep her memory alive. That man was dead to me. This person standing before me was someone I didn't recognize. But Linda wasn't done destroying what was left of my world. What she revealed next would expose a level of manipulation and calculation that would make my blood run cold and change how I viewed my mother's final months forever. Jessica, I think it's time you knew the whole truth, Linda said, settling back into my mother's chair like she had every right to be there. Your mother knew about me and your father. In fact, she gave us her blessing. The lie was so outrageous, so insulting to my mother's memory, that I couldn't even process it at first. My mother, who had loved my father with every fiber of her being for 26 years, had supposedly given permission for him to move on with his volunteer caregiver? That's impossible, I said, my voice shaking with rage. My mother would never... But Linda interrupted me with a smile that was pure evil. She did, sweetie. In fact, she asked me to take care of your father after she was gone. She said she wanted him to be happy, and that she trusted me to love him the way he deserved. The manipulation was so sick, so twisted, that I felt physically ill. My father finally found his voice, but instead of defending my mother's honor, he supported Linda's narrative. Jessica, your mother was very practical about these things, he said weakly. She knew I wouldn't do well alone, and she liked Linda. They spent hours talking in the hospital room while you were at work. The image of my dying mother being manipulated by this predatory woman made me see red. But I wasn't going to let them rewrite history to make themselves feel better about their betrayal. My mother had kept detailed journals throughout her illness, journals that I had been too grief-stricken to read after her death. If Linda was telling the truth about having my mother's blessing, it would be written in those pages. And if she was lying, well, that would be in there too. I stormed upstairs to my mother's bedroom, which thankfully Linda hadn't completely transformed yet, though I could see her cheap makeup scattered across my mother's antique vanity. I went straight to the closet where my mother had kept her journals, praying that my father hadn't thrown them away in his rush to erase her presence from the house. My hands were shaking as I pulled out the leather-bound book that covered her final months. What I read in those pages made me understand the true depth of Linda's manipulation and my father's weakness. My mother had written extensively about Linda, but not in the way Linda claimed. The volunteer Linda seems nice, but there's something about the way she looks at Robert that makes me uncomfortable. One entry read, "She asks too many personal questions about our marriage and our finances." Another entry, dated just 3 weeks before my mother's death, was even more revealing. I caught Linda holding Robert's hand today while she thought I was sleeping. When I asked her about it later, she said she was just comforting him, but I saw the way she smiled. I'm dying. Not stupid. My mother had known exactly what was happening, and it had broken her heart during the most vulnerable time of her life. But the final entry, written just 2 days before my mother passed away, would give me the ammunition I needed to expose Linda's lies and show my father what he had really done. The last entry in my mother's journal was like a letter written directly to me, and when I read it, I knew exactly what I had to do. My mother's final journal entry was dated just 48 hours before she died, and her handwriting was weak but determined. My dearest Jessica, if you're reading this, it means I'm gone and you've discovered the truth about Linda. I need you to know that I never gave my blessing for your father to be with her. In fact, I begged him to wait at least a year before even considering dating again. Not for my sake, but for yours. The entry continued. Linda has been manipulating your father's grief and loneliness from the moment she started volunteering here. She's not a caregiver. She's a predator who targets widowed men in hospitals. I've seen her do it before with other patients. I tried to warn your father, but he said I was being jealous and irrational because of the medication. I'm writing this so you'll know the truth. But the most devastating part came next. I found out that Linda is already married to a man named David Thompson in Oregon. She's been using a fake last name here. She's not pregnant with your father's baby. She's using that lie to trap him into marriage before he can discover her real identity. Check the marriage records in Portland, Oregon, under Linda Thompson. Save your father from this woman, Jessica. He's too blind with grief and loneliness to see what she really is. My hands were trembling as I finished reading. Linda wasn't just a homewrecker. She was a complete fraud who had targeted my grieving father as her next victim. I had the evidence I needed to expose her, but I also realized that my father's betrayal was even worse than I thought. He had chosen to believe Linda's lies over his dying wife's concerns. I could hear them talking downstairs, probably wondering what was taking me so long. Little did they know, I was about to turn their world upside down with the truth my mother had left for me to discover. I walked back downstairs with my mother's journal clutched in my hands like a weapon. Linda and my father were sitting close together on the couch, whispering like conspirators, but they separated quickly when they saw me coming. "Find what you were looking for?" Linda asked with fake sweetness, but I could see the worry in her eyes. She knew my mother had kept journals, and she was probably terrified of what they might contain. "Actually, yes," I said, opening the journal to my mother's final entry. "I found out the truth about both of you." My father's face went white as I began reading my mother's words aloud. With each sentence, Linda's confident facade crumbled, and by the time I got to the part about her being already married, she looked like she was going to be sick. "That's not true," Linda shouted, jumping to her feet. "Your mother was delusional from the pain medication. She didn't know what she was saying." But her panic told a different story. I pulled out my phone and started searching for marriage records in Portland, Oregon, just like my mother had instructed. Within minutes, I had found what I was looking for. Linda Marie Thompson, married to David Allen Thompson 3 years ago, still legally married according to public records. Before I could reveal my findings, tell me in the comments, what would you do if you discovered that your parent was being scammed by someone pretending to love them? Would you confront the scammer directly, or would you try to convince your parent first? Because what I decided to do next would either save my father or destroy what was left of our relationship forever. I turned my phone screen toward them, showing the marriage certificate I had found online. Linda Thompson, married to David Thompson in 2021, still married according to the state of Oregon. The silence that followed was deafening. Linda's face went from pale to bright red as she realized her web of lies was unraveling. "I can explain that," she stammered, but the confidence was completely gone from her voice now. "David and I are separated. We're getting divorced." But I wasn't finished with my revelations. I had done more research while upstairs, and what I discovered about Linda's pattern of behavior was even more disturbing than my mother had suspected. "Really? Because I also found records of you being arrested for fraud in Nevada 2 years ago, under the name Linda Martinez," I said, watching her face crumble as each lie was exposed. "And before that, you were investigated for elder abuse in California. You target grieving widowers, don't you? You find them at their most vulnerable and then manipulate them into giving you money and security." My father finally spoke, but instead of thanking me for saving him from a predator, he got angry at me. "Jessica, stop this right now. I don't care about Linda's past. I love her, and she loves me." His willful blindness to the truth was almost as heartbreaking as the original betrayal. This woman had targeted him like a vulture, and he was so desperate not to be alone that he was choosing her over his own daughter and his wife's memory. Linda tried to play the victim one more time. "Jessica, I know you're hurt, but you're destroying your relationship with your father over jealousy," she said, tears streaming down her face. "I'm carrying his baby. We're a family now, whether you like it or not." But I had one more card to play, one final revelation that would expose her most cruel lie of all. "No, Linda, you're not carrying his baby," I said, pulling up another document on my phone. "Because according to your medical records from Oregon, which are public due to your fraud case, you had a hysterectomy 5 years ago. You can't get pregnant." The look of pure terror on Linda's face when I mentioned the hysterectomy told me everything I needed to know. My father turned to stare at her, finally beginning to understand the magnitude of her deception. "Linda, Is that true? He asked, his voice barely a whisper. You can't have children. For the first time since I had arrived home, Linda had no quick answer, no manipulation ready to deploy. She stuttered, looking desperately around the room like she was searching for an escape route. The doctors were wrong about the hysterectomy. I got a second opinion, and they said I could still conceive. But even my father wasn't buying that ridiculous explanation. You could see the realization dawning in his eyes that he had been played by a professional con artist. Show me the pregnancy test, my father demanded, standing up from the couch. Show me the doctor's confirmation, the ultrasound pictures, anything that proves you're pregnant. Linda's silence spoke volumes. There was no test, no doctor's appointment, no baby. There had never been a baby. It had all been an elaborate lie to trap my father into marriage before he could discover her true identity. I felt a mixture of vindication and heartbreak watching my father finally see Linda for what she really was. But the damage had already been done. He had married this woman, betrayed my mother's memory, and chosen a stranger over his own daughter. Even if Linda disappeared from our lives right now, could I ever forgive him for what he had put our family through? Before I could find out what my father would do with this information, Linda made a decision that would show her true colors one final time. Linda suddenly grabbed her purse and headed for the door, but not before turning back to deliver one final vicious blow. You think you've won something here, Jessica? She snarled, her mask of sweetness completely gone now. Your father was desperate for affection because your mother was cold and distant during her illness. He came to me for comfort because she couldn't give him what he needed. The cruelty of using my dying mother's pain against us was breathtaking in its evil. But she wasn't done. And you? You're just a bitter daughter who can't stand the thought of her daddy finding happiness with someone else? That's why you're going to end up alone, just like your pathetic mother did. My father finally found his spine and stepped between us. Get out, he said firmly. Get out of this house right now and don't ever come back. Linda laughed bitterly. Fine, but our marriage is still legal, Robert. I'm entitled to half of everything, including this house that holds all your precious memories of your dead wife. The threat was clear. Even though her scam had been exposed, she could still take half of everything my parents had built together through the legal system. My father's face went white as he realized the financial trap he had walked into. Actually, Linda, I said with a smile that felt foreign on my face after everything I had been through, I don't think that's going to be a problem. I held up my phone, which had been recording our entire conversation since I came back downstairs with my mother's journal. I've got everything you just said on video, including your confession to fraud, your admission that the pregnancy was fake, and your threat to steal my father's assets. The expression on her face when she realized she had been caught in her own web was almost worth all the pain she had caused our family. Linda's eyes went wide with panic when she saw my phone. You can't record someone without their permission. That's illegal, she shouted, but her desperation was showing. I had done my research during those months of traveling, and I knew the recording laws in our state. Actually, Linda, this is a one-party consent state, which means I only need my own permission to record conversations I'm part of. And since you just confessed to multiple felonies, I think the police will be very interested in this evidence. My father was staring at Linda like he was seeing her for the first time, which in many ways he was. You never loved me at all, did you? He asked quietly. I was just another mark, another victim for you to exploit. Linda's silence was answer enough, but the cold look in her eyes as she calculated her next move was terrifying. She was a predator who had been cornered, and that made her dangerous. You have no idea who you're dealing with, Linda said menacingly. I've destroyed families before, and I can destroy what's left of yours too. Your father will never forgive you for humiliating him like this. You'll lose him forever. Her words hit their mark because part of me wondered if she was right. Would my father blame me for exposing the truth, or would he thank me for saving him from a sociopath? But my father's next words would show me exactly where his loyalties lay, and whether our relationship could survive the devastation Linda had caused. What he said next would determine whether I had a father left, or if Linda's final act of cruelty would be to destroy our family even after her lies had been exposed. As Linda headed for the door, she turned back one more time with a threat that made my blood run cold. This isn't over, Jessica, Linda hissed from the doorway. I still have copies of your father's financial information, his social security number, his bank account details. I can ruin his credit, empty his accounts, destroy his life even from a distance. The threat hung in the air like poison. Even caught and exposed, Linda still had the power to financially devastate my father as revenge for being discovered. My father looked defeated, like the weight of his mistakes was finally crushing him. What have I done? He whispered, sinking back onto the couch. I gave her access to everything. The joint bank account, the house deed, my retirement funds. She could take it all. I watched this broken man who had once been my strong, protective father, and despite everything he had done, my heart broke for him. Dad, look at me, I said, sitting down beside him. We're going to fix this. We're going to call the bank right now and freeze all your accounts. We're going to contact a lawyer about getting the marriage annulled based on fraud. And we're going to make sure Linda faces consequences for what she's done to you, and probably other families. For the first time since I had come home, I saw hope flicker in his eyes. But Linda wasn't done with her threats. You call the police, and I'll tell them your father was abusive to your dying mother. She called out from her car. I'll say he neglected her medical needs and forced her to approve our relationship. Who do you think they'll believe? A grieving daughter, or a concerned volunteer who tried to help? The evil calculation in her threat showed just how deep her manipulation went. I realized that fighting Linda was going to require more than just evidence and recordings. It was going to require courage, strategy, and the kind of determination my mother had shown while fighting her cancer. But I was ready for this battle, because I was fighting for my family's survival. As soon as Linda's car disappeared from our driveway, I sprang into action. Dad, I need you to focus and help me save what's left of our lives, I said firmly. First, we're calling your bank and reporting identity theft and fraud. Then we're calling your credit card companies to freeze all accounts she might have access to. We have maybe hours before she starts trying to drain your finances out of spite. My father moved like he was in a trance, but he followed my instructions. Within the next hour, we had frozen all of his financial accounts, reported the fraud to the authorities, and contacted a family lawyer about getting his marriage to Linda annulled. The lawyer assured us that a marriage based on fraud and false identity could be dissolved, especially with the evidence we had gathered. But the hardest conversation was still ahead of us. Dad, we need to talk about what happened with Mom, I said gently. I need to understand how you could have let Linda convince you that Mom approved of your relationship. My father broke down completely then, sobbing like I hadn't seen since the day my mother died. I was so lost without her, Jessica, so scared of being alone. When Linda said your mother wanted me to be happy, I wanted to believe it so badly that I ignored all the signs that she was lying. Dad, did you really have feelings for Linda while Mom was dying? I asked, dreading the answer but needing to know the truth. He looked at me with eyes full of shame and regret. I was attracted to the attention Linda gave me, but I never acted on it while your mother was alive. I swear to you, Jessica, I never physically cheated on your mother. But emotionally, I failed her when she needed me most. His honesty was painful, but necessary for us to move forward. But I still had one more question that would determine whether our relationship could be rebuilt. Dad, why didn't you tell me about the marriage? I asked, the hurt evident in my voice. Why did I have to find out by walking into my own childhood home and discovering a stranger had replaced my mother? My father's shame deepened as he struggled to find the words. I knew you would try to stop me. I knew you would see through Linda's lies because you're smarter than I am. I was weak and selfish, and I chose the easy path instead of facing the truth. You chose her over me, I said quietly. When you decided to marry her in secret, you chose a con artist over your own daughter. The pain in those words was almost unbearable, but it needed to be said. My father had not just betrayed my mother's memory, he had betrayed me too, by excluding me from a decision that would fundamentally change our family forever. Jessica, I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, my father said through his tears. I know I failed as a husband to your mother and as a father to you, but please don't give up on me completely. I want to spend whatever time I have left making this right, honoring your mother's memory the way I should have from the beginning. His words were a start, but I needed to see actions, not just promises. Over the next few days, my father proved his commitment to making amends in ways that surprised me. He donated Linda's belongings to charity, restored all of my mother's pictures to their proper places, and spent hours reading through her journals, finally hearing the concerns she had tried to share with him. But the real test of his remorse would come when the police investigation into Linda began. Would my father be strong enough to testify against the woman he had married, even knowing it would expose his own poor judgment to the world? The police investigation moved quickly once I turned over the evidence. Detective Morrison, who had handled similar cases involving Linda's previous victims, was amazed at how much documentation I had managed to gather. Your mother was incredibly thorough in her journals, he told me, and your recording of Linda's confession is probably the strongest evidence we've had against her in any jurisdiction. Linda was arrested 3 days later at a hotel outside the city, where she had been staying under another fake name while she planned her next move. When they searched her room, they found fake IDs, credit cards with multiple names, and a laptop containing detailed files on at least 12 other widowed men she had been researching as potential targets. My father was just one victim in a much larger operation. "Jessica, I need to ask you something difficult," Detective Morrison said during our follow-up interview. "We want to charge Linda with elder abuse and financial exploitation, but we need your father to cooperate fully with the prosecution. Is he prepared to testify about how she manipulated him, even though it will be embarrassing?" I looked at my father, who had been sitting quietly through the entire interview. "Yes," my father said firmly. "I'll testify. If it helps prevent Linda from doing this to other families, I'll tell the world how stupid and selfish I was." His willingness to face public humiliation for the sake of justice showed me that maybe, just maybe, the man who had raised me was still in there somewhere, buried under the grief and poor decisions. But before we could move forward with rebuilding our relationship, I needed to ask my father one final question, the answer to which would determine whether I could ever trust him again. "Dad, if I hadn't come home when I did, how far would you have let Linda's deception go?" I asked him directly. "Would you have given her access to Mom's life insurance money? Would you have let her sell this house and move you somewhere I couldn't find you?" The questions were harsh, but I needed to know if my father would have chosen Linda over me permanently, or if there was some line he wouldn't have crossed. My father was quiet for a long time before answering. "Honestly, Jessica, I don't know. I was so desperate to not be alone that I might have given her everything. The thought terrifies me now. But I was making decisions based on fear and loneliness, not love or logic." His honesty was brutal but appreciated. At least he wasn't trying to minimize the danger I had saved him from. "The worst part is that I was dishonoring everything your mother and I built together," he continued. "She worked 2 jobs to help pay for this house. She saved every penny so we could retire comfortably. And I was ready to hand it all over to a woman who saw me as nothing more than a bank account with emotions." The weight of his realization seemed to age him even more. "Dad, I need you to understand something," I said carefully. "I can forgive you for being lonely and making mistakes. I can even forgive you for falling for Linda's manipulation. But I can't forgive you for excluding me from your life and treating me like I didn't matter. If we're going to rebuild our relationship, that can never happen again." My father nodded solemnly. "Never again, Jessica. I promise you, never again." But promises were easy to make. The real test would be whether he could follow through when the next crisis hit our family. Over the following months, my father worked harder to rebuild our relationship than he had worked at anything since my mother's death. He went to therapy to process his grief properly instead of trying to escape it through Linda's false comfort. He volunteered at the cancer center where my mother had been treated, but this time to genuinely help families rather than to find his next relationship. And most importantly, he talked about my mother constantly, sharing memories and honoring her legacy in ways he should have been doing all along. The trial against Linda was swift and decisive. With the evidence we had gathered and testimony from her other victims, she was sentenced to 8 years in prison for fraud, identity theft, and elder abuse. Her husband David flew in from Oregon to testify about how she had emptied their joint accounts before disappearing to start her scam operation. My father's testimony was painful but powerful, and I was proud of him for having the courage to face his mistakes publicly. But the most healing moment came when my father asked if we could visit my mother's grave together. We hadn't been there as a family since the funeral, and I could see how much courage it took for him to face her memory after everything that had happened. "I need to apologize to her," he said quietly as we stood before her headstone. "I need to tell her I'm sorry for failing her when she needed me to be strong." Standing there in the cemetery, watching my father finally grieve properly for the woman he had loved for 26 years, I realized that Linda had stolen more than just money from our family. She had stolen precious time that we should have spent healing together, supporting each other through the worst loss of our lives. But she hadn't succeeded in destroying us completely. What happened next would test whether our family could truly heal from the trauma Linda had caused. 6 months after Linda's arrest, my father and I established new family traditions that honored my mother while building our own relationship. Every Sunday, we cooked one of her favorite recipes together and shared stories about her. Every month, we visited the cancer center to volunteer with families going through what we had experienced. And every year on her birthday, we planted flowers in the garden she had loved so much. My father also made concrete changes to ensure he could never be victimized again. He gave me power of attorney for all major financial decisions, not because he couldn't handle his affairs, but because he wanted the accountability of having to explain his choices to someone who loved him enough to tell him the truth. He joined a grief counseling group where he learned healthy ways to process loneliness without becoming vulnerable to predators. But the most important change was in how we communicated with each other. "Jessica, I need to tell you something," my father said one evening as we were looking through photo albums. "When your mother was dying, she made me promise to take care of you, not the other way around. I failed that promise when I let Linda manipulate me into prioritizing my own needs over your emotional well-being." His acknowledgement of how his choices had affected me was something I had needed to hear. "Dad, we both made mistakes," I replied. "I should have stayed closer after Mom died instead of traveling. I should have been here to support you through your grief." We were both learning that healing required taking responsibility for our own actions while also forgiving each other's failures. As we worked to rebuild our relationship, I often wondered what my mother would think of how we had survived Linda's attack on our family. A year after Linda's conviction, I found a letter my mother had written to both my father and me, hidden in her jewelry box. The letter was dated just a week before her death, and it contained her final wishes for our family after she was gone. "My dearest Robert and Jessica," it began, "if you are reading this together, it means you have found your way back to each other despite whatever challenges life has thrown at you." The letter continued, "Robert, I know you are going to struggle with loneliness, and there may come a day when you want to find love again. When that time comes, please remember that real love builds upon the foundation of what we had together. It doesn't try to erase it. And Jessica, please remember that your father's grief may make him make mistakes, but his love for you and for me is real. Be patient with him, and help him find his way back to the man I married." My mother had somehow known that we would face challenges that would test our family bond, and she had left us a roadmap for finding our way back to each other. Her wisdom from beyond the grave had been more valuable than any financial inheritance she could have left us. Reading her words together, my father and I both cried. Not tears of grief this time, but tears of gratitude for having had such an extraordinary woman in our lives. Today, my father and I have a stronger relationship than we've had since I was a child. Linda's betrayal nearly destroyed our family, but it also taught us valuable lessons about the importance of communication, the dangers of isolation during grief, and the power of forgiveness when it's earned through genuine remorse and changed behavior. My father will never again be the naive man who fell for Linda's manipulation, and I will never again be the absent daughter who assumed everything was fine from a distance. The most shocking part of this entire experience wasn't Linda's elaborate deception, or even my father's betrayal of my mother's memory. It was discovering how quickly a family can fall apart when grief, loneliness, and poor communication create the perfect storm for manipulation. Linda was a predator who targeted vulnerable people, but she only succeeded because we had failed to take care of each other when it mattered most. If this story has touched your heart or made you think about your own family relationships, I want to hear from you. Have you ever had to fight for someone you love who couldn't see they were being manipulated? Have you ever discovered family secrets that changed everything you thought you knew about your parents? Share your experiences in the comments below. Your story might help someone else who is going through something similar. Please share this video with anyone who might benefit from hearing about the warning signs of elder fraud or family manipulation. And if you want to hear more real-life stories about families overcoming betrayal and rebuilding trust, subscribe to this channel and hit the notification bell. Your support helps me continue sharing these important stories that remind us all about the power of truth, forgiveness, and the unbreakable bonds of real family love.